The day the studio went silent, the morning Los Angeles woke to a pale winter sun. Dean Martin was already awake, standing alone on the balcony of his hillside home. A porcelain cup cooling in his hands as steam lifted into the cold air like a quiet confession. From above, the city looked peaceful, almost innocent, but Dean had lived in Hollywood long enough to know that behind every glittering window was a storm of ambition. Fear and fragile egos colliding in silence. At 60, he no longer rushed toward sets with the hunger of a young man. He moved with deliberation now, not because age had slowed him, but because experience had taught him that the loudest moments in life often arrived without warning. And when they did, they demanded stillness, not noise. That morning, he felt it, an unexplainable heaviness, as though the air itself carried a story waiting to unfold. The film was supposed to be simple, a modest drama about second chances, no explosions, no scandals, just people, pain, and redemption. Dean had chosen the script himself after reading it one night while rain drummed against his windows. The pages blurring as something inside him stirred. He wasn't playing the lead. He didn't need to anymore. Instead, he had agreed to mentor the production, support a rising director, and share the screen with a new generation. Among them was a young actor whose name had begun circulating through studios like a spark near dry grass. Talented, handsome, magnetic, and increasingly difficult. The producers adored him because audiences did. They excused his lateness, his moods, his growing list of demands. That's what stars are like, they said. Dean never answered. He had known real stars. The kind that lifted rooms. The kind that arrived early and stayed late. The kind who remembered the names of the men holding the lights by the time. Dean's driver eased the car through the studio gates. The set was already tense. Crew members stood in loose clusters, coffee cooling in their hands. Eyes drifting again and again toward the empty space where the young actor's trailer should have been alive with movement. The call time had been 7. It was now approaching 11. For hours behind schedule, 4 hours of wages burned. For hours of quiet humiliation for assistants who had made excuses they no longer believed, Dean stepped out slowly, sunglasses catching the pale sky, his presence alone shifting the temperature of the place. Conversations lowered. Shoulders straightened. Not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it in a way Hollywood rarely saw anymore through consistency. Humility, and a career that never needed to shout. Inside stage 12. Lights blazed over a carefully built diner set meant to feel warm, forgiving, alive. Instead, it felt like a courtroom before a verdict. The director, a nervous man in his early 30s, paced near the monitors, running fingers through hair already pushed past its patience. He tried to smile when he saw Dean, but it cracked at the edges. "Mr. Martin?" he said, voice unsteady. Dean corrected him gently, as he always did. "Dean." He shook the man's hand, firm but kind, then looked around, taking in the silent machinery, the waiting faces. The crew that had shown up believing today would matter. "He's not answering," the assistant director finally admitted. "His agent says he's on the way." Dean nodded once, eyes soft, saying nothing. He took a seat near the monitors, not in a director's chair, not in a place of power, but among the crew. He asked the lighting tech where he was from. He complimented the set dresser's work. He laughed quietly with a makeup assistant who admitted she had grown up watching his old films with her grandfather. Time passed. Coffee cups emptied. Hope thinned. And with every minute, cost of one man's ego pressed heavier on the shoulders of everyone else. When the actor finally arrived, it wasn't with apology. It was with spectacle. A sleek black car rolled up, music thudding through closed doors, followed by laughter as though nothing sacred had been interrupted. He stepped out in sunglasses despite the indoor call, phone still at his ear, smile tilted with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no in a language that mattered. Assistants rushed forward, relief tangled with resentment. He waved, finished his call, then glanced around as if surprised the world had continued existing without him. "Sorry, traffic," he said lightly, though anyone who lived in Los Angeles knew better. He moved toward his trailer without looking at the crew, without seeing the people who had waited half a day for him to decide. They were real. Dean watched it all from his seat. He didn't stand immediately. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. Instead, he looked at the director, then at the producer who had defended this behavior too many times, then at the young man himself, now joking with his manager near the doorway. Dean rose slowly, every movement unhurried, as though time bent slightly around him. The set seemed to quiet without instruction. Even the hum of the lights felt like it lowered. "Double quote, son," Dean said. The word carried, not loud, but weighted. The young actor turned, amused at first, then uncertain when he saw who had spoken. Dean took a few steps closer, stopping not in confrontation, but in presence. There was no anger on his face. There was something far more dangerous. Disappointment as eyes moved briefly past him. To the crew, to the tired director, to the woman holding a clipboard with hands that had begun to shake hours ago. Then he looked back at the young man, and that was when the room understood something was about to change, not because Dean Martin was a legend, but because he was. I'm about to remind everyone what that word used to mean. The young actor opened his mouth, perhaps to joke, perhaps to charm, perhaps to deflect as he always had. Dean lifted a hand gently, not to silence him, but to pause him. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost tender. "Pack your things." No echo followed. No gasp. Just a sudden, unbearable stillness. As if the air itself had stopped working. The young actor laughed once, short and unsure. "What?" Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. He simply held the young man's eyes, and in them was not authority, but a mirror. A reflection of choices, of patterns, of a future that was beginning to close. "I said," Dean continued softly, "pack your things, brown them." People began to realize something sacred was breaking, and something far more important was about to be built. The producer stepped forward instinctively. "Dean, let's talk." Dean turned to him, not sharply, but firmly. "We have been talking," he said, "for 4 hours. Then he looked back at the young actor, whose smile had fully vanished now, replaced by a flicker of something unfamiliar. Fear. "You don't get to call yourself a professional," Dean said quietly, "if you only show up when it's convenient to be one." No one breathed, because everyone knew this wasn't about lateness. It was about who this industry was becoming, and whether anyone still had the courage to stop it. The young actor glanced around, searching for laughter, for support, for the invisible shield fame had always wrapped around him. He found only eyes. Real ones, tired ones, waiting ones. Dean stepped back. "Go," he said gently, and the word carried more finality than any shout ever could. The young man stood there, frozen at the exact place where his career had been built and where, without yet realizing it, it had just been broken open. Not ended, opened, because some endings were only the beginning of the truth, and this was one of them. When the applause stopped, the studio did not erupt after Dean Martin's words. There was no dramatic shouting, no slammed doors, no instant chaos the way movies like to imagine moments of power. Instead, something far heavier settled over stage 12. A silence so dense it pressed against the ears. A silence that felt like history deciding which direction it would move. The young actor still stood where he was, fingers flexing once at his sides, as if trying to wake himself from a dream he had not agreed to enter. Around him, crew members remained frozen, caught between the habit of obedience and the unfamiliar sight of accountability unfolding in real time. For years, he had arrived late and been met with laughter, apologies, rearranged schedules, and the invisible bending of reality around his comfort. Today, he was being met with something he had almost forgotten existed: consequences. The producer cleared his throat again, softer this time, as if testing whether sound was still permitted in the room. "Dean, he's young. He made a mistake. We can reset the day. We can talk privately." His voice carried a practiced smoothness, the the tone of a man who had smoothed disasters into footnotes for decades. Dean turned his eyes toward him slowly, and for the first time that morning, something like steel moved beneath the calm. "A mistake," Dean said quietly, "is knocking over a light. A mistake is forgetting a line. A mistake is being human. What happened today was a choice, and choices teach people what we are willing to tolerate." He let his gaze travel again, not theatrically, but deliberately, across the set. Over the boom operator whose arms had trembled hours ago, over the costume assistant who had missed her son's school assembly to be here on time, over the young director who had not yet learned how quickly compromise could turn into surrender. Every minute he was late, Dean continued, every one of these people was told their time mattered less than his mood. If we erase that now, we teach him it was true. The young actor's jaw tightened. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, forcing a small, brittle laugh. "I'm here now. Let's shoot." Dean looked at him again, and this time there was no disappointment left in his expression, only clarity. "You don't arrive for hours late and then offer presents like a gift," he said. "Presence is the minimum. Respect is the work." The word struck harder than shouting ever could. The young man's face flushed, irritation rising as the armor of charm began to fail. "Do you know how many people would kill for this spot?" he snapped. "Do you know what I bring to a project?" Dean nodded once. "Yes," he said simply. "I know exactly what you bring. That's why this hurts you more than it hurts us." That unsettled him. The actor opened his mouth again, then closed it, thrown off rhythm. Dean took a step closer, lowering his voice not to intimidate, but to narrow the world until only truth fit inside it. "Talent is loud," he said, "but character is what people hear after the applause ends. And right now, the room is very quiet." Behind them, someone exhaled. Someone else set a coffee cup down. Life began to move again, cautiously, as though the set itself were testing whether gravity had changed. The producer looked between them, calculating budgets, contracts, headlines. But something else was happening too, something he could not measure. The crew was watching, not in gossip, in recognition. They were seeing someone powerful choose them over convenience. And that kind of moment, once witnessed, does not disappear. "Go to your trailer," the producer finally said to the young actor, trying to reclaim control. "Let's cool off." Dean shook his head once. "No," he said. "He doesn't go to his trailer. He goes home." The word landed differently this time. He goes home. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Final. The young actor stared at him, disbelief giving way to something closer to panic. "You can't do this," he said. "You're not even the lead. You don't have that authority." Dean didn't answer immediately. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a folded piece of paper worn at the creases, softened by time. He handed it to the producer without ceremony. The man opened it, eyes moving quickly, then stopping. His face changed, subtly, but permanently. It was a letter. One signed weeks ago. One that gave Dean not fame, not billing. Not money, but the right to walk away. And take the project's credibility with him if the environment violated the values he had agreed to protect. The producer looked up slowly. "Dean," he began. Dean placed a hand over the letter, gently pressing it closed. "I'm not threatening," he said. "I'm choosing." He turned back to the young actor. "You think this is me ending something?" he said. "But I'm actually offering you the first honest moment of your career. Whether it becomes the worst day of your life or the most important one is up to what you do after you leave this building." The actor's throat moved. He glanced again at the crew. But now their eyes were not resentful. They were expectant, waiting to see who he would become. For a second, something softer. Something that might have cracked the moment open into apology. But pride arrived first, as it so often did. He scoffed under his breath, shook his head, and turned away. "This industry eats people like you alive," he muttered. Dean's reply followed him, not sharp but steady. "No," he said. "It eats people who confuse being admired with being untouchable." The door to the stage closed behind the young actor with a muted sound that felt far louder than it was, and only then did the room truly react, not with cheers, but with breath, with motion, with the slow return of gravity. The director sat down heavily, hands over his face. Someone laughed weakly from the lighting crew, the kind of laugh that came after near accidents. The makeup assistant wiped her eyes without knowing when they had filled. And Dean Martin, the man who had just appended a rising star's trajectory, did not stand in the center of it. He moved quietly toward the craft table and poured himself another cup of coffee, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But outside, beyond the walls of Stage 12, phones were already vibrating. Agents were already calling. Stories were already bending into shape, and the young actor, sitting alone in his car, hands locked on the steering wheel, felt something he had not felt since before fame had found him. Silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that asks questions, the kind that does not let you answer with applause, and far above the studio lot. Unseen by any of them, clouds began to gather, not with rain, but with the weight of what comes after a fall, because careers do not usually end the moment someone tells you to leave. They end in the hours after, when the world decides whether it will open another door or finally close the ones it has been quietly holding. The fall you don't hear. The first thing the young actor noticed after he drove away from the studio was how loud the city suddenly felt. Not in sound, but in indifference. Cars passed him without slowing. Billboards still smiled. A group of tourists laughed on a corner as if nothing in the world had just cracked open. He pulled over 2 blocks from the lot, hands still clenched around the wheel, chest tight, waiting for something to happen. A call, a message, a rescue, something that would turn the last hour into a misunderstanding. But his phone lay dark on the passenger seat, screen reflecting his face back at him like a stranger's. He had been famous for only 3 years. But fame compresses time. It convinces you that acceleration is permanence. In those 3 years, he had been told yes more times than he had heard his own name growing up. Yes to roles. Yes to interviews. Yes to behavior that would have once cost him jobs before he ever stepped on a set. He had learned the grammar of entitlement quickly, fluently, without realizing he was forgetting another language, entirely responsibility. He started the engine again and drove without direction, letting the city choose for him. Sunset Boulevard slid past like a memory he didn't own. The studio towers that once made his chest lift now felt like monuments to a life that might already be receding. His phone buzzed at a red light. His breath caught. He snatched it up, not his agent. A news alert. The headline was careful. Studios always were at first. It used words like departure and creative disagreement. But beneath it, in smaller print, were phrases that bit harder. 4-hour delay. On-set disruption. Veteran actor intervenes. Veteran. The word stung more than insult. Veteran meant history. Survival. A weight he had not yet earned. He scrolled. The comments were already multiplying. Strangers dissecting a moment they did not witness, building conclusions from fragments. Some defended him. Some didn't. But almost all of them were asking the same unspoken question. Who do you think you are? The light turned green. Horns sounded behind him. He drove on. His agent finally called 20 minutes later. The voice that once overflowed with easy confidence now carried edges. "We've got a situation," she said. "You need to come to my office now." The office, usually a place of warm lighting and rehearsed optimism, felt colder when he arrived. She didn't stand to greet him. She didn't smile. She gestured to a chair he had sat in many times before, but today it felt like a witness stand. "What happened?" she asked. He exhaled sharply. "Dean Martin threw me off a set," he said. "Over traffic." She held his gaze for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "He didn't." She slid her tablet across the desk. It wasn't news. It was email production heads, casting directors, studio legal teams, all dated within the last hour, all cautious, all polite, all distancing. The phrases were nearly identical. Reevaluating future collaborations, concerned about working environment, pausing discussions. Pausing, he had once learned that pausing was how powerful people said no without burning bridges. He looked up, pulse quickening. They can't blacklist me over this. She didn't answer immediately. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with an expression he could not place. This isn't a blacklist, she said. This is an audit. Of what? Of who you've been, she replied. And whether anyone wants to keep explaining it? The words hit deeper than any headline. Dean Martin didn't end anything today, she continued. He made it visible. For the first time, anger faltered. Something else began to surface beneath it. Confusion, fear, a thin, unfamiliar doubt. It was one day, he said. One late day, she nodded. And for assistance wrote me this morning asking not to be assigned to you again. 2 wardrobe teams quietly declined your next project. A driver quit last month. A junior producer asked for removal from your press tour 2 weeks ago. He stared at her. Why am I hearing this now? Because until today, she said gently, every one of those people was invisible. Silence filled the space between them. Real silence. The kind not padded by applause or background music, or an audience waiting to be impressed. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. When you first came to me, she went on, you were early to everything. You thanked everyone. You remembered names. You asked questions. Somewhere along the way, being surrounded by people who needed you, turned into believing you were the reason they existed. Her words landed with surgical precision. Not cruel. Exact. He swallowed. So what now? She studied him, and something in her softened. Now, she said, we find out whether today was the first time anyone told you the truth, or the last time anyone bothered. He left the office in a daze, the city now blurred into streaks of light and motion. He didn't go home. Home was too large, too quiet, too full of mirrors. He drove instead toward the ocean, toward a stretch of public beach he had not visited since before premieres and private entrances. He parked far from the crowded areas and walked until the sand thinned and the water darkened. The wind off the Pacific cut through his jacket. He welcomed it. It felt honest. He sat down hard on the sand, staring at the line where the water erased itself again and again. The tide moved without caring who he was. For the first time in years, something in him loosened. A thought rose uninvited. If I lost all of this, who would I be? He tried to answer and found nothing ready. Memories began to surface instead. Of arriving in the city with one suitcase and a borrowed car. Of sleeping in it some nights. Of standing in open calls, surrounded by men who looked just like him. All of them smiling the same practiced smile. All of them terrified of the same erasure. He remembered being late once, years ago, for a theater audition. The director had closed the door. No speeches. No arguments. Just absence. He had sat on the curb outside and cried in a way he had not since childhood. He hadn't cried today. He hadn't even apologized. The realization spread slowly like cold. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. He turned, startled. An older man stood a few feet away, bundled against the wind, holding a fishing pole. His face was lined not with age, but with exposure. You dropped this, the man said, extending his hand. It was his phone. He had not realized it had fallen. Thanks, he murmured, taking it. The man studied him for a moment. Rough day? He asked, not prying, simply observing. The young actor hesitated. Every instinct told him to deflect, to perform, to turn the moment into something clever. Instead, to his own surprise, he nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I messed something up. The man's gaze moved back to the water. Most people don't notice until they mess something up, he said. That's usually how it starts. How what starts? Change, he replied. The word lingered between them, light and heavy at once. The man wished him a good night and walked on. Leaving behind nothing but footprints the tide would soon erase. The young actor remained, where he was long after the sky darkened, long after the wind stiffened, long after his phone filled again with messages he could not yet open. Somewhere across the city, Dean Martin sat alone at a piano in his home, fingers resting on keys he was not playing, listening to a silence very different from the one the young man was learning to hear. Dean knew something the young rarely did, that falls were loud, but reckoning was quiet, and it was only just beginning. The measure of a name the city did not explode the way he expected. There were no screaming headlines the next morning, no public condemnation, no dramatic television debates. What arrived instead was far more unsettling, quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the professional kind. The kind that spoke through unanswered emails. Meetings that were suddenly postponed, projects that began to restructure. His agent's messages grew shorter. Studio responses became formal. The world that once felt crowded with opportunity now felt like a room where people had politely begun to step back toward the walls. He woke late. The ocean still in his clothes, the weight of the night sitting in his chest. He stared at the ceiling of his apartment, watching light move across a space that had once felt like proof of arrival and now felt like a waiting room. For the first time since he had come to Los Angeles, he did not know where he was supposed to be. The habit of performance still tugged at him. Post something humble. Call a journalist. Control the story. But something quieter resisted. The words of the old man at the beach, repeated in his mind. Most people don't notice until they mess something up. He dressed without urgency, drove not toward an office, but toward the part of the city where ambition stopped being decorative. East, where streets grew narrower and the buildings older. Where acting schools still smelled like dust and hope instead of money. He parked outside a small community theater he had once auditioned for and failed. He hadn't thought about it in years. Inside, a handful of young performers were rehearsing under dim lights. No cameras. No agents. No guarantees. Just voices, bodies, and belief. He stood unnoticed in the back, watching a young woman miss a line and apologize too quickly. Watching a young man repeat a movement again and again until his shoulders burned. No one cared who he was. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like relief. He stayed longer than he meant to. When the rehearsal ended, he approached the director, a woman with tired eyes and a kind of steadiness he had not seen in executives. "Do you ever need help?" he asked. "With anything? Sets? Classes? Whatever?" She studied him, uncertain, then nodded. "We could always use another pair of hands." So he started showing up. Not announced, not credited, just early. He swept floors. He moved chairs. He painted flats until his arms ached. Sometimes, when asked, he read lines with students who were shaking with nerves before their first auditions. He didn't offer advice unless it was requested. And when it was, he spoke less about fame and more about discipline. Less about success and more about who you were when no one was watching. Weeks passed. The industry's distance did not vanish. But something else began to grow. Wait, not the crushing kind, the grounding kind. He learned the names of everyone in the building. He learned which students worked night shifts, which ones sent money home, which ones were thinking about quitting. He saw himself in them in ways he hadn't expected. Not the actor he had become, but the one he had been before anyone was impressed by him. One evening, after locking up, he found an envelope taped to the door. No return address. Inside was a simple card. "Come by the studio. Stage 12. Tomorrow at 6. No signature, but he knew. He arrived early. The lot was quiet at that hour. The sky bruised with late color, the air cool with the approach of night. Stage 12's door stood open. Inside, only a few lights were on. The diner set was gone. In its place stood a single piano under a soft overhead glow. Dean Martin sat at it, hands resting lightly on the keys. He did not turn when the young man entered. "You're on time," he said. "Yes, sir," the young man replied. Dean shook his head slightly. "Try again." The young man swallowed. "Yes, Dean." Dean gestured to a chair nearby. Sit. They remained like that for a moment. The space between them filled with all the words that could have been said and didn't need to be. Finally, Dean spoke. I heard you've been working at a theater. The young man looked down. I didn't think anyone would notice. Dean's fingers brushed a few keys. Not a melody, just sound. Notice is what brought you here, he said. It's not what keeps people, he turned then, studying the young man not as an authority, but as a witness. Why did you go there? The young man hesitated. Then, for the first time since his career began, he answered without strategy. Because no one cared who I was, he said, and I needed to remember who I am when that happens. Dean nodded once. That's the right answer. The young man's throat tightened. Why did you really stop the set? He asked quietly. Dean leaned back slightly, eyes distant. Because 40 years ago, he said, I watched a man with more talent than sense walk into a room like that and treat people like furniture. I watched him become untouchable. And then I watched him become alone. He died convinced the world had betrayed him. The truth was worse. What was it? No one had ever stopped him, Dean said. He looked back at the young man. I wasn't ending your career that day. I was interrupting it. Silence settled again, but this time it did not hurt. Dean stood and crossed the space between them. He did not offer a contract. He did not offer a role. He extended his hand. I can't give you back what you had, he said, but I can show you how to build something that won't leave the first time you disappoint it. The young man rose, taking his hand, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with fame. Weeks later, when the young man finally returned to his set, it was not a major production. It was a small, independent film, crewed mostly by people who knew his name but not his reputation. He arrived before sunrise. He helped unload equipment. He listened. He learned. And when mistakes happened, he owned them. No articles were written about that day, but careers are not measured by what makes noise. They are measured by what endures. Months later, at a small awards event, few cameras attended. Dean Martin was asked what he believed made a true professional. He smiled gently. The way you treat people when they can't do anything for you, he said, and the way you respond when someone finally tells you the truth. Across the room, the young actor stood quietly, applauding with the rest. No one introduced them. They didn't need to, because some stories are not about how careers end. They are about how names begin to mean something again.